Welcome to the Daily History Chronicle. Each day, we travel back to discover a pivotal moment that changed the world. These aren't just dates and facts. They're stories of courage, conflict, innovation, and consequence that still echo through our lives today. Are you ready to explore? Let's see what happened on this day in history.
Welcome to the Literary Deep Dive, where we explore classic literature with fresh insight. I'm Richard Backus from University Teaching Edition. Welcome to the final episode of our journey through William Golding's Lord of the Flies. Over the past 3 episodes, we've explored how World War II destroyed Golding's faith in human progress. Watch civilization begin with hope on that island and witness the descent into savagery, the murders of Simon and Piggy, the shattering of the conch, Ralph hunted through burning jungle by boys who were choir singers just weeks earlier. Today we reach the shattering conclusion. We'll examine the novel's complex legacy since 1954, explore why it continues to be banned and challenged, discuss its adaptations and influence on dystopian fiction, and confront why every generation needs to grapple with Golding's refusal to comfort us about human nature. This is where we ask the final, unavoidable question. What does Lord of the Flies tell us about ourselves that we'd rather not know? Ralph is running for his life through burning jungle. Jack's entire tribe is hunting him with sharpened sticks. They've set the island ablaze to smoke him out. Everything Golding has built for 200 pages, the slow erosion of civilization, the murders, the complete transformation from British schoolboys to savage hunters, comes to its climax. Ralph bursts onto the beach, and there stands a naval officer in crisp white uniform. The rescue has come, but it's come too late. The officer sees boys with painted faces holding sharpened sticks. He sees an island on fire. He doesn't yet know about the murders, but he's already making assumptions. Fun and games. We saw your smoke. Are there any adults, any grown-ups with you? Ralph can barely speak. No, sir. And then, 2. They're dead. The officer is uncomfortable now. This doesn't match his expectation of British boys having an adventure. He's read The Coral Island. He mentions it explicitly, and he expected a different story. A story where British boys maintain civilized order, where the natural superiority of British culture prevails. Instead, he's facing the truth that Golding has been showing us all along. British civilization, education, choir practice, good breeding, none of it matters when the structures restraining human nature collapse. These boys are no different from any other humans throughout history. Given the right conditions, they become exactly what we've watched them become. And then Ralph weeps. Ralph wept for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, and the fall through the air of the true wise friend called Piggy. This is one of literature's most devastating final passages. Ralph isn't weeping because he's been rescued. He's weeping because he knows now what he's capable of. He's weeping for the loss of the comforting lie that humans are fundamentally good. He's weeping because Piggy, intelligence, reason, civilization itself, is dead and can never come back. The other boys begin crying too, and Golding writes, "The officer, surrounded by these noises, was moved and a little embarrassed. He turned away to give them time to pull themselves together, and waited, allowing his eyes to rest on the trim cruiser in the distance." That final image is crucial. The officer turns away toward his warship, his trim cruiser, his symbol of adult civilization. But what is that warship? It's a machine designed for killing. It's part of the adults' war, the same war that crashed these boys onto the island in the first place. The adults haven't transcended savagery. They've just organized it, industrialized it, made it more efficient. The rescue isn't really a rescue. It's a temporary reprieve. The boys are leaving one island of violence to return to a world at war, a world where adults commit atrocities on scales these boys couldn't imagine. The beast isn't defeated. It's everywhere. It always has been. This is why the ending is so disturbing. It doesn't offer redemption or hope or the promise that the boys have learned something that will make them better. It offers only the recognition that we are what we are, and civilization is a thin, fragile, temporary constraint on impulses that never go away. Before Lord of the Flies became a classic, it was a manuscript that publishers kept rejecting. Golding submitted it to multiple publishers in 1953 and 1954, and the responses were consistently negative. One publisher wrote, "It does not seem to us that you have been wholly successful in working out the theme, and we doubt whether it would be well received." Another rejected it as absurd and uninteresting fantasy, rubbish and dull. Think about what this reveals. Publishers in 1954. Britain didn't want this story. They wanted boys' adventure tales. They wanted optimism and British triumph. They wanted the Coral Island, not its dark inversion. Faber and Faber finally published it in 1954, but only after significant editorial pressure to cut the Lord of the Flies scene, the one where the pig's head speaks to Simon. The publisher thought it was too much, too weird, too explicitly allegorical. Golding reduced the scene but refused to eliminate it entirely, understanding that this confrontation with externalized evil was essential to the novel's argument. Initial sales were modest, reviews were mixed. Some critics praised its psychological insight. Others found it too dark, too pessimistic, too disturbing for a novel about children. The British public in 1954 wasn't quite ready to confront Golding's vision of human nature, but then American college professors discovered it. By the early 1960s, it had become assigned reading in universities. By the late 1960s, it appeared on high school syllabi. By the 1970s, it was canonical, one of those books that every educated person was expected to have read. What changed? The Vietnam War, the assassinations of Kennedy, King, and Kennedy again, the violence of the Civil Rights Movement, and the violent backlash against it, the Kent State shootings. Americans were confronting their own capacity for collective violence, their own beast. And suddenly Golding's dark vision seemed not pessimistic, but accurate. The novel the publishers called rubbish and dull has never been out of print since 1954. It sold tens of millions of copies. It's been translated into dozens of languages. It's taught in schools worldwide. And it's been challenged, banned, and fought over in communities across America for 70 years. Lord of the Flies appears regularly on the American Library Association's list of most challenged books. Parents and school boards have attempted to ban it for multiple reasons, and understanding these objections reveals why the novel remains threatening. Violence. The murders of Simon and Piggy are brutal. Golding doesn't sanitize them. He describes Piggy's head opening and stuff coming out. He shows boys tearing Simon apart with teeth and claws. Parents argue this is too graphic for young readers. But this objection misses the point. The violence isn't gratuitous. It's essential to Golding's argument. He's showing what humans actually do to each other when restraints break. Sanitizing the violence would be lying about human nature, which is precisely what Golding refuses to do. Bad language. The novel contains damn and hell and British profanity. Some school districts have challenged it on these grounds. This is perhaps the most absurd objection. The novel is about children murdering each other, and we're worried about the word damn. It reveals how uncomfortable people are with the novel's actual content. so uncomfortable they focus on trivial language issues instead. Defiance of authority. The boys reject adult rules, kill each other, descend into chaos. Some parents worry this models disrespect for authority and could encourage rebellion. This objection fundamentally misunderstands the novel. Golding isn't celebrating the boy's descent into savagery. He's horrified by it. The novel is a warning about what happens when authority and structure disappear, not a celebration of chaos. Pessimism about human nature. This is the real objection, though it's rarely stated explicitly. The novel suggests humans are fundamentally flawed, that civilization is fragile, that given the right conditions, we're all capable of terrible things. This contradicts what many people want to believe about themselves and their children. We want to believe we're fundamentally good, that education and proper upbringing create moral people, that our children would never do what these boys did. Golding says, yes, they would. We all would. Under the right circumstances, with the right fears and the right group dynamics, and the right charismatic leader offering simple answers, we become exactly what these boys became. That's the truth people want to ban. Not the violence or the language, but the uncomfortable recognition of what we are. The irony is that every attempt to ban the novel proves its thesis. Groups of people, convinced they're protecting children, use their collective power to silence a voice telling uncomfortable truths. They paint their faces with righteousness, join together in purpose, and attack what they've designated as dangerous. They become, in miniature, the very mob mentality Golding warns against. Peter Brook's 1963 film adaptation remains the most faithful to Golding's vision. Brooks shot on location in Puerto Rico with actual boys, many of them not professional actors. The result has a documentary quality, raw, uncomfortable, disturbing. Brooks understood that the novel's power comes from its refusal to sentimentalize childhood. He didn't cast cute child actors who play at savagery. He cast boys who could genuinely embody the transformation from civilized to savage. The painted faces look genuinely menacing. The violence looks genuinely dangerous. Simon's murder and Piggy's death have real weight. The 1990 American adaptation, directed by Harry Hook, made the fatal error of moving the setting to present day and making the boys American military cadets. This completely undermines Golding's point. The British boys in the novel are supposed to represent the pinnacle of civilized upbringing. Making them military cadets, boys already trained in violence and hierarchy, makes their descent less shocking. Brooks' version understands what Hook's doesn't. The horror comes from watching choir boys become killers. The more civilized they start, the more devastating the transformation. Neither film quite captures the novel's internal psychological depth, particularly Simon's mystical understanding and Ralph's deteriorating consciousness. Film is an external medium. We see faces and actions, but can't access the fragmentation of thought that Golding renders so brilliantly in prose. The Lord of the Flies scene, which works through Simon's possibly hallucinatory internal experience, becomes awkward when literalized on screen. But Brooks' film does something crucial. It takes the novel seriously. It doesn't soften the ending. It doesn't suggest redemption. It lets us sit with the discomfort of what we've witnessed, just as Golding does. Lord of the Flies fundamentally changed how we write about civilization's collapse. Before Golding, most survival narratives followed the Coral Island model. Civilized people maintain their values in primitive settings and ultimately triumph. After Golding, that narrative became impossible to write unselfconsciously. Every survival story, every dystopian novel, every examination of social collapse now exists in dialogue with Lord of the Flies. Suzanne Collins's The Hunger Games is unthinkable without Golding. Children forced into violence, the spectacle of savagery, the question of whether civilization's veneer is thicker than we want to believe. All of this comes directly from Lord of the Flies. Stephen King's The Long Walk and The Running Man explore similar territory. What happens when society removes restraints on violence? How quickly do civilized people adapt to barbarism? Even Battle Royale, the Japanese novel and film that directly influenced The Hunger Games, acknowledges its debt to Golding. The premise, children forced to kill each other, is Lord of the Flies, with different mechanisms but the same fundamental question about human nature. The television series Lost engaged explicitly with Golding's novel. Characters reference it. The show's structure, people stranded on an island, struggling to maintain civilization, fracturing into factions, deliberately mirrors Golding's framework. Lost ultimately offers a more optimistic view of human nature, but it earned that optimism by first acknowledging Golding's darker truth. Cormac McCarthy's The Road, though set in a post-apocalyptic landscape rather than an island, explores similar questions. When civilization collapses, what remains? How do we maintain humanity when survival demands brutality? McCarthy's answer is more hopeful than Golding's. The father and son maintain their moral code, but the question itself comes from Golding. The dystopian boom in young adult fiction over the past 20 years, Divergent, The Maze Runner, The Giver, all descend from Lord of the Flies. They're asking the same questions. What happens when authority structures fail? Can humans create just societies, or do we inevitably descend into violence and tribalism? Golding gave us the template. Take away the structures, introduce scarcity and fear, offer a charismatic leader who promises simple solutions, and watch what emerges. Every dystopian novel since has been exploring variations of that basic insight. Since publication, critics and readers have debated what Lord of the Flies actually means. These interpretations reveal as much about the interpreters as about the novel. The religious reading. Some critics interpret the novel as Christian allegory. Simon represents Christ, the one who sees truth, is rejected, and dies for trying to save others. The Lord of the Flies is literally Beelzebub, Satan. The island is Eden corrupted by original sin. Ralph's weeping at the end represents recognition of humanity's fallen nature. This reading has textual support, but it's not complete. Golding was skeptical of organized religion, and the novel doesn't offer religious redemption. Simon dies, but his death doesn't save anyone. The Christ parallel highlights the tragedy. Even when truth appears, we kill it. The political reading. Others interpret the novel as political commentary. Ralph represents democracy, well-intentioned but ultimately weak when challenged by authoritarianism. Jack represents fascism, charismatic leadership that offers simple answers, scapegoats enemies, and uses violence to maintain power. Piggy represents intellectualism and rationalism, which fascism always destroys first. This reading explains the novel's reception in the 1960s when Americans were grappling with Vietnam and civil rights. The novel seemed to predict how democracies fail, how good people participate in evil systems, how charisma triumphs over competence. The psychological reading. Modern critics often interpret the novel through psychology. The characters represent different aspects of the psyche. Ralph is ego, mediating between desires and reality. Jack is Ed, pure impulse and desire. Piggy as superego, internalized rules and rational thought. Simon as something transcendent, perhaps Jung's concept of the self. The island becomes the mind, and the descent into savagery represents what happens when the ego loses control, when impulses overwhelm rational thought, when the superego is destroyed, when transcendent understanding is killed by our baser nature. The gendered reading. Feminist critics note that this is an all-male world and ask, would girls descend into the same savagery? Golding wrote an all-male cast deliberately, arguing that the male capacity for violence was central to his theme. But this raises questions. Is the beast specifically male? Does the novel suggest that violence is inherently masculine? Some critics argue this is a limitation of the novel, that by excluding girls entirely, Golding made a claim about universal human nature based on specifically male behavior. Others argue that including girls would have introduced sexual dynamics that would distract from the central theme. The colonialist reading. More recent critics have examined the novel's relationship to colonialism. The boys are British. They expect to find savages on the island whom they'll need to civilize or conquer. Instead, they become the savages. This inverts the colonial narrative. Civilization doesn't civilize the savage, it reveals that the colonizers were always savage. But the novel also perpetuates certain colonial assumptions, that savagery is characterized by painted faces, tribal chants, primitive violence. Golding uses markers of primitive cultures to signify the boys' descent, which implicitly others those cultures. The truth is that Lord of the Flies supports multiple interpretations because it's working on multiple levels simultaneously. It's religious allegory and political commentary and psychological drama and commentary on colonialism. Great literature contains multitudes. In the 1990s, researchers attempted a real-world test of Golding's premise. 6 boys from Tonga were stranded on an uninhabited island for 15 months in 1965. When they were finally rescued, they had maintained cooperation, created a functional society with rules and leadership rotation, and successfully survived without descending into violence. Some critics pointed to this as evidence that Golding was wrong. Real boys, when actually stranded, didn't become savages. They became more civilized. But this example doesn't disprove Golding's argument. It misunderstands it. Golding wasn't saying that any group of boys stranded anywhere would automatically descend into savagery. He was exploring the specific conditions that enable that descent: the absence of adults, the presence of fear, the introduction of a charismatic, authoritarian leader, the availability of violence as a solution, the gradual erosion of taboos. The Tongan boys had a different cultural background, different personalities, different group dynamics. Most importantly, they apparently didn't have a Jack, someone actively working to undermine democracy and offer authoritarianism as an alternative. But the gender question remains. Would a group of girls have descended into the same violence? We have limited real-world examples, but psychological research suggests some differences. Girls' aggression tends to manifest more through social exclusion and psychological manipulation than physical violence. Girls' hierarchies tend to be more fluid and less rigidly enforced. Girls socialized in the 1950s, when Golding was writing, were specifically trained to be cooperative, nurturing, nonviolent. But, and this is crucial, women participate in mob violence. Women participated in lynchings in the American South. Women served as concentration camp guards in Nazi Germany. Women engage in online harassment mobs. The capacity for collective violence isn't exclusively male. What Golding captures is something about human nature, not exclusively male nature. The tendency to form tribal groups, to designate outsiders, to use violence to solve problems, to follow charismatic leaders who offer simple answers to complex fears. Would the specific manifestations differ with girls? Almost certainly. Would the fundamental dynamics Golding identifies, the fragility of civilization, the seduction of power, the psychology of mob violence, disappear? The evidence suggests not. 70 years after publication, Lord of the Flies has become more relevant, not less. We're watching its dynamics play out in real time, globally, digitally, constantly. The beast that the boys create through collective fear, that's QAnon. That's every conspiracy theory that gains power not through evidence, but through collective belief. The beast isn't real until enough people believe it's real, and then it becomes real enough to motivate violence, to justify persecution, to override rationality. Jack's strategy of creating fear and offering himself as protector, that's every authoritarian leader worldwide. Putin, Erdogan, Orban, Xi, Bolsonaro, Trump. The specific political ideologies differ, but the playbook is identical. Identify or create an enemy, amplify fear, position yourself as the strong leader who will protect the tribe, demand loyalty over truth. The ritual chant before Simon's murder, that's every political rally where crowds work themselves into frenzy, where individual judgment dissolves into collective momentum, where people do and say things as part of a group that they'd recognize as wrong individually. The way the boys rationalize Simon's murder, that's every online mob that destroys someone and then insists they deserved it, that they brought it on themselves, that everyone's just holding them accountable. The mechanisms of collective violence have moved online, but the psychology remains identical. Piggy's murder, the destruction of reason and intellectualism, that's the global assault on expertise, on science, on any form of knowledge that contradicts what people want to believe. Climate scientists are ignored. Doctors receive death threats for recommending vaccines. Intellectuals are designated as enemies of the people. Piggy dies in every society that decides feelings matter more than facts. Ralph's weeping for the end of innocence, the darkness of man's heart, that's every moment when we confront what humans are actually capable of. January 6th, the Myanmar genocide, the war in Ukraine, the ongoing atrocities in Gaza and Sudan. Every time we think we've evolved past barbarism, every time we convince ourselves that education and technology have made us better, reality forces us to confront the same darkness Golding identified in 1954. The novel refuses to offer comfort, and that's exactly why we need it. We're constantly tempted to believe we're different, that we've progressed, that the beast is defeated. Golding reminds us, no, the beast is always there. Civilization requires constant, conscious, exhausting effort. The moment we stop choosing civilization, the moment we give ourselves permission to paint our faces and join the chant, we become what we've always been capable of becoming. In 1983, nearly 30 years after Lord of the Flies was published, William Golding received the Nobel Prize in Literature. The Nobel Committee cited his novels for illuminating the human condition in the world of today. In his Nobel lecture, Golding reflected on what he'd learned from writing Lord of the Flies. I must say that anyone who moved through those years without understanding that man produces evil as a bee produces honey must have been blind or wrong in the head. Man produces evil as a bee produces honey. Not occasionally, not when corrupted by bad influences, naturally, intrinsically, as our fundamental nature. This is what Golding never wavered from, his dark assessment of human nature, his conviction that the beast is real and lives inside us, his refusal to offer false comfort about who we are and what we're capable of. The Nobel Prize represented vindication. The novel that publishers had rejected as rubbish and dull, that parents had fought to ban, that critics had dismissed as too pessimistic. This novel had become recognized as essential literature, as a work that captured fundamental truths about human nature that we ignore at our peril. Golding didn't celebrate the prize with optimism about humanity's future. He remained until his death in 1993 convinced that civilization is fragile and humans are dangerous. But he also believed that recognizing this truth is better than living in comfortable delusion. If we know the beast exists, if we acknowledge what we're capable of, we can at least choose to maintain the structures that restrain us. We can't eliminate the darkness, but we can refuse to give it permission. We can't make humans fundamentally good, but we can build societies that make goodness easier and evil harder. This is the only hope Golding offers. Not that we'll transcend our nature, but that we'll recognize it and choose consciously and continuously to constrain it. We've reached the end of our journey through Lord of the Flies. We've examined Golding's biography, his dark vision forged in the fires of World War II. We've watched civilization begin with hope and collapse into savagery. We've witnessed the murders of Simon and Piggy, the shattering of the conch, Ralph's weeping for the darkness of man's heart. We've explored the novel's publication struggle, its influence on dystopian fiction, the debates about its meaning, and its continued relevance in 2025. And now we face the question Golding forces on every reader. What does this novel tell us about ourselves that we'd rather not know? It tells us that education doesn't make us immune to savagery. The boys are educated, civilized British schoolboys, and they become killers. It tells us that good intentions don't prevent evil outcomes. Ralph means well, but his democracy fails. It tells us that reason and intelligence aren't enough. Piggy is right about everything, and he dies anyway. It tells us that knowing the truth doesn't protect you. Simon understands what the beast really is, and they kill him for trying to share that truth. It tells us that we're capable of terrible things when we act collectively, things we'd recognize as wrong individually. It tells us that civilization isn't an achievement we've secured. It's a choice we make, moment by moment, against powerful impulses toward tribalism, violence, and domination. It tells us that the beast is real, not as an external threat, but as an internal reality. We are the beast. The darkness lives in us. And perhaps most uncomfortably, it tells us that recognizing all of this doesn't exempt us from it. Reading Lord of the Flies and understanding its message doesn't make you immune to mob mentality, to tribalism, to the seduction of charismatic authority. The boys didn't lack knowledge. They lacked the strength to choose civilization when savagery offered more immediate rewards. Can you make that choice? Can I? Can any of us consistently, under pressure, when the crowd is chanting and the faces are painted and joining feels easier than standing alone? That's the question the novel leaves us with. Not answered, not resolved, just there, waiting, every time we face a choice between the difficult path of civilization and the easy path of giving in to our worst impulses. I'm Richard Backus, and this has been the Literary Deep Dive's exploration of William Golding's Lord of the Flies. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of literature's darkest and most essential works. Until next time, may you choose wisely between the conch and the painted face, between reason and ritual, between the hard work of maintaining civilization and the easy pleasure of letting it burn. because that's what Lord of the Flies teaches us. Not just about those boys on that island, but about all of us, every day, in every choice we make between being human and becoming beasts.